The smell of lavender and old books still haunts me. 3 years have passed since that October night when everything I believed about family shattered like my grandmother's china against cold, hard reality. But I can still smell her house. That particular blend of vanilla candles, worn leather from her favorite armchair, and the faint trace of the rose perfume she'd worn every day for 60 years. My grandmother Rose was the only person in this world who loved me without conditions, without expectations, without the bitter taste of disappointment that seemed to follow every interaction I had with my parents. While they saw me as a burden, a financial drain, a constant reminder of their own failed dreams, Grandma Rose saw me as her treasure, her second chance at nurturing something beautiful in a world that had grown increasingly cold. Her house on Maple Street was my sanctuary. A modest two-story Victorian with peeling blue paint and a wraparound porch that sagged slightly under the weight of countless summers, it wasn't much to look at from the outside. But inside, every corner held memories. Every room whispered stories of love that transcended the petty cruelties that defined the rest of my family. The kitchen, with its checkered linoleum and the ancient gas stove that clicked twice before igniting, was where she taught me to bake her famous sugar cookies. Her hands, soft and warm despite their age, would guide mine as we rolled dough and cut perfect circles that never came out quite as perfect as hers. "Perfection is overrated, sweetheart," she'd say, her voice carrying the gentle authority of someone who had learned life's most important lessons through living rather than lecture. Love makes everything taste better. The living room, dominated by her burgundy velvet couch and the mahogany coffee table that bore the ring stains of 1,000 afternoon tea sessions, was where we'd spend entire Sundays reading together. She'd sit in her recliner, the one with the worn armrests that perfectly fit her small hands, while I sprawled on the carpet with whatever book had captured my imagination that week. Sometimes we'd read aloud to each other, taking turns with chapters, her voice bringing characters to life with the skill of someone who understood that stories were meant to be shared, not simply consumed. But it was her bedroom, the sanctuary within the sanctuary, that held the deepest magic. The walls were covered with photographs spanning 8 decades. Wedding pictures from 1952, baby photos of my father and his sister, school portraits and graduation ceremonies, Christmas mornings and summer vacations, all carefully arranged in a visual timeline of a life well lived. Her vanity table, with its trifold mirror and collection of perfume bottles, was where she'd let me play dress up, applying her lipstick with the reverent care of a child being initiated into the mysteries of womanhood. If you've ever had someone in your life who made you feel completely understood and unconditionally loved, you know how rare and precious that connection is. Share in the comments if you've been blessed with a grandparent like mine. My parents, David and Margaret Thompson, viewed their visits to Grandma Rose's house with the barely concealed impatience of people fulfilling an obligation rather than enjoying an opportunity. They'd sit stiffly on her couch, checking their phones and making small talk that felt rehearsed and hollow. Dad would glance at his watch every few minutes, while Mom would comment on things that needed fixing around the house with the tone of someone cataloging assets, rather than noticing where a beloved person lived. "That roof is going to need attention soon," Mom would say, her eyes scanning the ceiling with the calculating gaze of someone already planning renovations. "And those hardwood floors could be refinished. They'd add significant value. Value." Everything with my parents came down to value, to worth, that could be measured in dollars and cents rather than memories and meaning. They looked at Grandma Rose's house and saw square footage and market potential. I looked at the same rooms and saw Saturday mornings making pancakes, rainy afternoons playing board games, Christmas Eves when the tree lights made everything magical, and countless nights when I'd sleep over just because being there felt more like home than the sterile suburban house where I officially lived. The contrast between my relationship with Grandma Rose and my relationship with my parents was stark enough to create its own weather system. With her, I was cherished, celebrated, seen as someone with potential and purpose. With them, I was tolerated at best, criticized constantly, and reminded regularly that my existence was an expensive inconvenience that had disrupted their carefully planned life trajectory. Rose spoils her too much, my mother would say when she thought I couldn't hear, her voice carrying the particular venom reserved for discussing someone whose generosity made her own selfishness more obvious by comparison. She's going to have unrealistic expectations about life. Unrealistic expectations. Like expecting to be loved unconditionally. Like believing that family meant something more than shared DNA and legal obligations. Like thinking that the people who brought you into the world might actually want you to thrive, rather than merely survive. But Grandma Rose did spoil me, gloriously and unapologetically. She spoiled me with attention when my parents were too busy with their careers to notice whether I was struggling or succeeding. She spoiled me with homemade meals, when dinner at home meant reheated takeout, eaten in silence while everyone stared at their devices. She spoiled me with stories about her childhood during the Depression, her courtship with Grandpa James, her early years as a mother when the world was different, and families still gathered around dinner tables to share their days. Most importantly, she spoiled me with the radical idea that I was worth loving exactly as I was, without need for improvement or modification or apology. The phone call came on a Tuesday night in October, the kind of crisp autumn evening when the air smells like fallen leaves and wood smoke, when the world feels balanced on the edge between seasons. I was in my dorm room at the community college, struggling through calculus homework that might as well have been written in ancient Greek, when my phone buzzed with my father's number. Sarah, his voice was different somehow, flatter than usual, carrying news that I knew instinctively would change everything. I need you to come home. Your grandmother passed away this evening. The words hit me like a physical blow, driving the air from my lungs and making the fluorescent lighting in my cramped dorm room seem suddenly harsh and unforgiving. Passed away. Such a gentle phrase for such a devastating reality. My grandmother, my anchor, my safe harbor, my one reliable source of unconditional love, was gone. What happened? I managed to whisper, my voice sounding strange and distant even to my own ears. She was fine when I talked to her on Sunday. She was planning to make apple pie for my birthday next week. Her heart, Dad said, his tone carrying the brisk efficiency he used for business calls. It was quick. She didn't suffer. She didn't suffer. As if that somehow made the loss more bearable. As if the manner of her leaving could diminish the magnitude of what her absence would mean. But I was grateful for that small mercy. That her final moments had been peaceful. That she'd slipped away without pain or fear. Probably in her sleep in the bedroom where she'd dreamed for decades. The drive home felt endless. Every mile stretching like taffy, as I tried to process the impossible reality that the world could continue existing without Rose Thompson in it. The familiar landmarks of my childhood, the gas station where she'd buy me candy, the park where we'd feed ducks, the library where she'd helped me find my first chapter books, all looked the same, but everything felt fundamentally different, like someone had adjusted the color saturation and left the world slightly off kilter. I kept expecting to see her car in her driveway, kept anticipating the moment when this would all turn out to be some terrible mistake. When I'd walk up those familiar porch steps and find her in her kitchen, humming while she prepared tea and asking about my classes with the genuine interest that made even my most boring assignments feel worthy of discussion. But her driveway was empty except for fallen leaves that no one had raked, and the house sat dark and silent in the October twilight, its windows like closed eyes that would never again light up with warmth and welcome. My parents' house, where I was expected to stay during the funeral arrangements, felt more foreign than ever. The sleek furniture and neutral color palette that my mother had chosen to create what she called sophisticated ambiance now seemed cold and unwelcoming. A sterile museum where people happened to sleep rather than a home where anyone actually lived. We'll need to start going through her things, Mom announced over a dinner of grocery store rotisserie chicken that we ate in the dining room reserved for special occasions, though nothing about this felt special, only hollow and ritualistic. The funeral is Thursday, and will want to have the house cleared out as quickly as possible afterward. Cleared out. The casual brutality of the phrase made my stomach clench with something beyond grief, something that tasted like betrayal mixed with disbelief. We were talking about my grandmother's belongings, the accumulated treasures of 87 years of living, and my mother was discussing them like items on a to-do list. "What's the rush?" I asked, my voice sharper than I'd intended. "She just died today. Can't we at least wait until after we bury her before we start dividing up her possessions?" Dad looked up from his phone, where he'd been scrolling through emails with the dedication of someone who found work preferable to processing emotion. "There are practical considerations, Sarah. The house needs to be prepared for sale, and that takes time. We can't let sentiment slow down necessary business." Necessary business. My grandmother's entire life reduced to necessary business, as if the rooms where she'd loved and laughed and created a lifetime of memories were nothing more than real estate that needed efficient processing. I wanted to argue, wanted to insist that we honor her memory with something more than ruthless efficiency, but the weight of grief was making it hard to think clearly, hard to form words that could adequately express the wrongness of treating her death like a corporate restructuring. That night, lying in my childhood bedroom with its pale pink walls and the glow-in-the-dark stars we'd applied to the ceiling when I was 8, I stared at the familiar shadows and tried to imagine a world without my grandmother's voice on the other end of the phone, without her house as my refuge, without her unwavering belief that I was someone worth loving completely. Sleep felt impossible, but eventually exhaustion won over grief, and I drifted into restless dreams filled with the sound of her laughter and the scent of her sugar cookies, baking in an oven I would never see again. I woke before dawn with the disorienting sensation that something terrible had happened. That moment of confusion between sleep and waking when your mind hasn't yet caught up with reality. For a few blessed seconds, I existed in a world where Grandma Rose was still alive, still in her house on Maple Street, probably already awake and preparing her morning tea with the deliberate care she brought to all of life's small rituals. Then memory crashed over me like cold water, and the truth settled into my chest with the weight of something permanent and irreversible. The funeral home smelled of flowers and industrial carpet cleaner, a combination that would forever remind me of saying goodbye to the person I'd loved most in the world. My grandmother looked smaller somehow in the casket they'd chosen for her, wearing the navy blue dress she'd saved for church and special occasions, her hands folded over the worn leather Bible that had been her daily companion for as long as I could remember. People filed past offering condolences that ranged from genuine sympathy to obligatory politeness, their words blending into a background hum of social ritual that felt disconnected from the reality of my loss. Neighbors who had known her for decades, members of her church congregation, elderly friends who had shared countless bridge games and coffee mornings. They all understood that something irreplaceable had been lost, but it was my parents' behavior that began to plant the seeds of something darker than grief in my chest. While I sat beside her casket struggling to accept that I would never again hear her call me sweetheart or feel her soft hands smoothing my hair, they worked the room like politicians at a fundraiser, accepting sympathy with the practiced grace of people performing rather than feeling. "She lived a full life," my mother would say to each visitor, the phrase delivered with identical timing and inflection, as if she'd rehearsed the response. "We're grateful she didn't suffer." "The service will be beautiful," my father would add, his handshake firm and his smile appropriately somber. She would have appreciated how many people came to pay their respects. They spoke about her in past tense with the finality of people who had already moved on, who had already processed her death as a completed transaction rather than an ongoing loss that would echo through every remaining day of their lives. The funeral service itself was a blur of hymns and scripture readings, of a pastor who had known her well speaking about her kindness and faith with genuine warmth. I tried to focus on his words about eternal rest and heavenly reunion, but my attention kept drifting to practical details that seemed suddenly urgent. Who would tend her rose garden? Who would feed the neighborhood cats that had adopted her back porch as their breakfast spot? Who would maintain the little free library she'd installed in her front yard for children walking to school? These weren't questions about property or possessions, but about the ongoing impact of a life well lived, about the countless small kindnesses that had made her corner of the world a little brighter and more welcoming. If you're reading this and thinking about someone you've lost, someone whose absence left a hole that can never quite be filled, I'd love to hear about them in the comments below. Sometimes sharing these memories helps keep their spirit alive. The cemetery was peaceful in the way that only October afternoons can be, with golden sunlight filtering through trees that were just beginning to turn colors, creating patterns of light and shadow that seemed almost too beautiful for such a sorrowful occasion. As they lowered her casket into the ground beside my grandfather's grave, I felt something fundamental shift inside me, a recognition that my childhood, the safe, unconditionally loved part of it anyway, was being buried along with her. But it wasn't until we returned to my parents' house after the service that the first crack appeared in what I had assumed was our shared grief, our common understanding that we had lost someone irreplaceable, who deserved to be honored and remembered with reverence rather than haste. "I've scheduled the estate sale company to come look at the house tomorrow," my mother announced as she changed out of her funeral dress into casual clothes that seemed jarringly normal for a day that had been anything but normal. "They can have everything cleared out by the weekend." I stared at her, certain I had misheard. "Tomorrow? You're having strangers go through Grandma's things tomorrow?" "There's no point in waiting," Dad said, loosening his tie with the relief of someone who considered the formal obligations of grief complete now that the funeral was over. "The sooner we get the house on the market, the better. Real estate moves slowly in the winter months." The casual cruelty of it hit me like a slap. While her grave was still fresh, while the flowers from her service were still fragrant, they were already planning to erase every trace of her existence from the house where she had created a lifetime of love and memories. "But what about her photographs?" I asked, my voice rising with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Something beyond grief, something that tasted like panic mixed with rage. "What about her recipes, her books, her sewing project? She was working on a quilt for my 21st birthday. What happens to all the things that made her who she was?" Mom sighed with the patience of someone explaining obvious facts to a slow child. "Sarah, she was 87 years old. She had accumulated decades of clutter that nobody needs or wants. The estate sale people will sort through everything and price it appropriately. Whatever doesn't sell will be donated to charity. Clutter." My grandmother's treasures, the accumulated artifacts of a life filled with purpose and meaning, dismissed as clutter that needed efficient disposal. The wedding china she had saved for decades, the hand-embroidered tablecloths she had made as a young bride, the cedar chest filled with baby clothes she had kept from when my father and aunt were small, all of it reduced to inventory for strangers to sort and price and sell to the highest bidder. "I want to go through her things first," I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "Before the estate sale people. I want to save some of her belongings, things that have meaning." "What would you do with them?" Dad asked, not unkindly, but with the practical concern of someone who had never understood the difference between sentimental value and actual value. "You live in a dorm room. You don't have space for furniture or collections. It's better to let professionals handle the disposition of her assets." Assets. Even her belongings were assets now, items with monetary rather than emotional worth, things to be liquidated rather than treasured. I wanted to scream that her recipe box wasn't an asset but a connection to Sunday mornings when she'd teach me to make her famous apple pie. I wanted to explain that her photograph albums weren't inventory, but windows into decades of love and joy and celebration. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled up with grief and disbelief, and the growing recognition that my parents and I were experiencing her death in fundamentally different ways. They went to bed early that night, claiming exhaustion from the emotional toll of the funeral. But I could hear them in their bedroom making phone calls and discussing logistics with the brisk efficiency of people managing a complex but routine business transaction. I lay in my childhood bed listening to the sounds of grief being processed as paperwork, and something inside me hardened into a resolve I hadn't known I possessed. The next morning, I drove to Grandma Rose's house before my parents woke up, using the key she had given me years before when I'd started staying over regularly. The house felt different in the early morning light, quieter somehow, as if it understood that its purpose was ending and its future was uncertain. I walked through the rooms slowly, trying to memorize every detail before strangers came to catalog and price and remove everything that had made this place a home, rather than just a house. The kitchen still smelled faintly of her last batch of cookies. Her reading glasses were still folded on the table beside her favorite chair. Her bed was still unmade from the morning she had unknowingly made it for the last time. In her bedroom, I opened the jewelry box that had sat on her vanity for as long as I could remember. The wooden music box that played For Elise when you lifted the lid. Inside, alongside the modest collection of rings and necklaces that had been her treasures, was an envelope with my name written in her careful script. My heart stopped as I recognized the handwriting that had adorned countless birthday cards and Christmas packages. The careful loops and flourishes of someone who had learned penmanship when it was considered a vital life skill. With trembling hands, I opened the envelope and unfolded the letter inside. "My dearest Sarah," it began, and immediately her voice was in my head, warm and loving and impossibly present despite her absence. "If you are reading this, then I am gone, and you are probably feeling lost and alone in ways that no 20-year-old should have to experience." The letter continued for 3 pages, written in the flowing script that had become as familiar to me as my own handwriting, filled with memories of our time together and hopes for my future that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. She wrote about the cookies we'd baked, the books we'd shared, the countless conversations that had helped shape my understanding of what love could look like when it wasn't conditional on performance or perfection. "I know your parents love you in their way," she wrote, "but they have forgotten how to love without measuring, how to give without calculating returns. Don't let their limitations become your limitations. Don't let their fears about scarcity make you afraid to be generous with your heart." But it was the final paragraph that stopped my breath entirely. "I have left you something in my will, sweetheart. Not money or jewelry, but this house where we made so many beautiful memories together. I want you to have a place that will always be yours, where you can create your own family traditions and fill the rooms with laughter and love the way we did. Your parents may not understand this gift, but I trust you to honor the spirit in which it is given." I read the words 3 times before their meaning fully penetrated the fog of grief and shock that had surrounded me since Tuesday night. She had left me the house. This house, with its sagging porch and peeling paint, and every room filled with evidence of unconditional love, was supposed to be mine. But my parents were planning to sell it. They were bringing in estate sale professionals to clear it out and real estate agents to put it on the market, treating it like an asset to be liquidated rather than a gift that was meant to connect me to her memory forever. The letter shook in my hands as the full implications of what I had discovered began to settle into place. Either my parents didn't know about her will, which seemed impossible, given their immediate plans to sell, or they knew and were choosing to ignore it. The possibility that they were deliberately disregarding her final wishes, that they were planning to steal the gift she had left me, created a cold fury in my chest that was unlike anything I had ever experienced. I drove home with the letter clutched in my hands, my mind racing through possibilities and implications, and the growing certainty that I was about to discover something about my parents that would change our relationship forever. They were in the kitchen when I walked through the front door, sitting at the breakfast table with coffee and newspapers spread between them, looking relaxed and normal in a way that suddenly seemed like an elaborate performance. "You're up early," Mom said, without looking up from her paper. "I thought you might sleep late after yesterday." I placed the letter on the table between them, watching their faces carefully as they registered what they were seeing. The change was immediate and unmistakable. Dad's coffee cup paused halfway to his lips, while Mom's eyes went wide with what looked like genuine shock. "Where did you find this?" she asked, her voice carefully controlled, but carrying an undertone of something that might have been panic. "In her jewelry box?" I said, my own voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "Where she left it for me to find, along with the will that leaves me her house." The silence that followed was different from the comfortable quiet of a family sharing breakfast. This was the silence of people calculating their next moves, weighing their options, deciding how much truth they could afford to reveal. "Sarah," Dad said finally, setting down his coffee with the deliberate care of someone buying time to think. "Estate law is complicated. Just because someone writes something down doesn't make it legally binding." "But she had a will," I said, my voice getting stronger as my anger began to overcome my grief. "A legal document that specifies her wishes for what should happen to her property after she dies. And according to this letter, she wanted me to have the house." Mom folded her newspaper with sharp, precise movements that spoke of barely controlled agitation. "Your grandmother was getting older, Sarah. Sometimes elderly people make decisions that don't take practical realities into account. We have to consider what's best for everyone involved." What's best for everyone involved. The phrase had a familiar ring to it, the kind of justification my parents had always used when their decisions happened to benefit them at my expense. What's best for everyone involved was why we hadn't taken family vacations when I was younger. What's best for everyone involved was why they hadn't been able to afford the art classes I'd wanted to take, or the school trip to Washington, D.C., or the prom dress that would have made me feel beautiful instead of apologetic. "Did you know about the will when you scheduled the estate sale?" I asked, watching their faces for tells, for the small signs that would reveal how deep their deception ran. Another pause, another careful exchange of glances between people who had obviously discussed this conversation before it happened. "We know there's a document," Dad said carefully, "but it hasn't been probated yet. Nothing is official until the courts review everything and determine what's legally valid. The technical language, the lawyers speak deflection, the way they were talking around the simple question I had asked, it all confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. They had known about her will, about her intention to leave me the house, and they had decided to ignore it." "So you knew she wanted me to have the house, and you scheduled strangers to come clear it out anyway?" I asked, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "You knew this was supposed to be my inheritance? And you made plans to sell it without even telling me?" "It's not that simple," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction, carrying the hollow tone of someone who knows their argument is morally bankrupt, even if it might be legally defensible. "It seems pretty simple to me," I said, standing up from the table with movements that felt foreign to my own body, as if anger was transforming me into someone I didn't recognize. "Grandma left me her house. She wanted me to have a place that would always be mine, a connection to all the love and memories we shared there, and you decided to sell it anyway." For families reading this who have dealt with inheritance disputes, you know how ugly these situations can become. If you've faced something similar, I'd appreciate hearing your story. Sometimes knowing we're not alone in these battles makes them easier to bear. The kitchen felt too small for the magnitude of what was happening, too domestic and normal for a conversation that was reshaping everything I thought I knew about my parents' character and priorities. The morning sunlight streaming through the windows seemed incongruous with the darkness of what I was discovering about the people who had raised me. "Sarah, sit down," Dad said, his voice carrying the authoritative tone he used when he wanted to end discussions rather than have them. "Let's talk about this rationally." But I didn't want to sit down. I didn't want to be managed and manipulated and talked into accepting something that felt fundamentally wrong. I wanted answers, and I wanted them delivered with the same clarity and honesty that had characterized every conversation I'd ever had with my grandmother. "When did you find out about the will?" I asked, remaining standing despite his directive. "When did you learn that she had left me the house?" The question hung in the air, like smoke, visible and toxic and impossible to ignore. I could see them weighing their options, calculating how much truth they could admit to without completely destroying their position. "We've been handling your grandmother's legal affairs for the past few months," Mom said finally, her voice carrying the careful precision of someone who had rehearsed this explanation. "When her health started declining, she asked us to help her get her paperwork in order." "So you knew months ago that she intended to leave me the house?" I said, the pieces falling into place with sickening clarity. "You've known since before she died that this was her wish, and you've been planning to ignore it the entire time." "It's not about ignoring anything," Dad said, his voice taking on the frustrated edge that meant he was losing control of the conversation. "It's about making responsible decisions based on practical realities rather than emotional impulses." Practical realities, emotional impulses. My grandmother's final gift to me, her carefully considered decision about how to dispose of her most valuable possession, dismissed as an emotional impulse that needed to be corrected by more practical people who knew better. "What practical realities?" I demanded. "The reality that I'm 20 years old and you don't think I'm capable of owning property? The reality that selling the house would give you money you think you deserve more than I deserve the gift she wanted to leave me?" The accusation hung between us like a bridge that, once crossed, would change our relationship permanently. I could see in their faces that I had identified the core of their motivation, the ugly truth they hadn't wanted to acknowledge even to themselves. "The house needs significant repairs," Mom said, her voice defensive now, all pretense of patient explanation abandoned. "The roof, the plumbing, the electrical system, everything needs updating. You don't have the money for that kind of maintenance, and you don't have the experience to manage property ownership responsibly. So you decided that instead of helping me learn to manage it, you'd just take it away from me entirely," I said. "Instead of honoring her wish that I have a permanent home, a place that would always be mine, you decided to sell it and keep the money." "We decided to make the choice that serves everyone's best interests," Dad said, his voice carrying the finality of someone who considered the discussion closed. "Including yours, whether you're mature enough to recognize it or not." The condescension in his tone, the casual dismissal of my capacity to understand my own best interests, triggered something in me that went beyond anger into a realm of cold, clear fury that felt almost surgical in its precision. "My best interests," I repeated slowly. "Let me see if I understand this correctly. My grandmother, who loved me unconditionally and knew me better than anyone else in my life, decided that leaving me her house would serve my best interests. But you, who have spent the last 20 years treating me like an expensive inconvenience, have decided you know better than she did about what I need." "Sarah," Mom began, but I cut her off. "No," I said, my voice carrying authority I didn't know I possessed. "You don't get to Sarah me out of this conversation. You don't get to use that patronizing tone to make me feel like I'm being unreasonable for expecting you to honor a dead woman's wishes about her own property." I walked to the kitchen window and stared out at their perfectly manicured backyard, with its professional landscaping and automatic sprinkler system, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. This wasn't just about a house, though the house mattered enormously. This was about respect, about honesty, about the fundamental question of whether they saw me as a member of this family whose interests mattered, or as a minor inconvenience whose wishes could be disregarded whenever they conflicted with more important priorities. "I want to see the will," I said, turning back to face them. "The actual legal document. I want to read exactly what she wrote about the house and about me." Another pause. Another exchange of glances that spoke of strategies and contingency plans they had hoped not to need. "The will is with the lawyer," Dad said. "It's part of the probate process." "Then I want the lawyer's name and number," I said. "I want to schedule my own appointment to discuss the estate and my inheritance." "You don't need your own appointment," Mom said quickly. "We can handle all the legal aspects. There's no reason for you to get involved in the complicated parts of estate settlement." But I was already pulling out my phone, already searching for probate lawyers in our area. already recognizing that if I wanted to protect my grandmother's wishes, I was going to have to fight for them, without help or support from the people who should have been on my side. I'm getting involved because it's my inheritance, I said, scrolling through search results. I'm getting involved because someone needs to advocate for what Grandma Rose actually wanted, since apparently the people she trusted to execute her estate have decided to ignore her instructions. The silence that followed was thick with implications and accusations that none of us were quite ready to voice directly. But the battle lines had been drawn, and all three of us understood that this was no longer a family discussion about practical matters. This was a legal and moral conflict that would determine not just what happened to my grandmother's house, but what remained of our relationships with each other. That afternoon, I made the first of what would become many phone calls to lawyers, trying to understand my rights and options as a beneficiary who suspected she was being cheated out of her inheritance. The legal system, I learned, was not designed for urgency or emotional clarity. It was designed for procedures and paperwork and processes that could take months or years to resolve. But I also learned that wills were serious legal documents that couldn't simply be ignored by executors who disagreed with the deceased's decisions. If my grandmother had legally left me her house, then my parents couldn't simply sell it without my consent, regardless of their opinions about my readiness for property ownership. The lawyer I finally chose, a middle-aged woman named Patricia Kelman who specialized in estate disputes, had a calm, professional manner that reminded me somehow of my grandmother. Someone who listened carefully before offering advice, who asked thoughtful questions rather than making assumptions, who treated my concerns as legitimate rather than the emotional overreactions of someone too young to understand complex situations. "Bring me any documentation you have," she said during our initial phone consultation. "The letter you found, any other papers your grandmother might have left, anything that might help us understand her intentions regarding the house." I drove back to Grandma Rose's house that evening, using my key for what I suspected might be the last time before my parents changed the locks or the estate sale company took possession. The house felt different in the fading autumn light, more fragile somehow, like a place holding its breath while its fate was decided by people who had never understood its true value. In her bedroom, I went through her dresser drawers and her desk more systematically than I had that morning, looking for any additional documents that might support her intention to leave me the house. What I found was even more disturbing than what I had expected. Hidden in a folder marked "Important Papers" was a copy of her will, dated just 6 months before her death, clearly stating that her house and its contents should pass to me upon her death, with the hope that Sarah will find in this home the same love and security that it has provided to me throughout my life. But there was also another document, dated just 2 weeks after the will, a power of attorney agreement giving my parents complete authority to manage her financial and legal affairs in the event of incapacity or illness that prevents me from handling these matters myself. My hands shook as I read the implications of what I had found. The power of attorney gave my parents the legal right to make decisions about her property, but only if she was unable to make those decisions herself. However, the will was dated after the power of attorney, which suggested that she had still been competent enough to make legal decisions about her estate when she wrote it. But there was more. In the same folder, I found correspondence between my parents and a real estate company, dated 3 days before my grandmother's death, discussing the market value of her house and the best strategies for a quick sale. They had been planning to sell her house before she was even dead, treating her impending death as a business opportunity rather than a family tragedy. The discovery hit me like a physical blow, making me sit down heavily in her desk chair as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. This wasn't just about disregarding her will after she died. This was about actively working to undermine her wishes while she was still alive, planning to dispose of her property as if her stated intentions were irrelevant obstacles to be circumvented rather than respected. I photographed every document with my phone, creating a digital record that couldn't be destroyed or hidden, then carefully returned everything to its original location. Whatever legal battle was coming, I wanted to be armed with evidence of both her true intentions and my parents' deliberate efforts to ignore them. The drive home felt like traveling between two different worlds. The world where my grandmother's love and wisdom still echoed through every room of her house, and the world where my parents lived in comfortable denial of the pain they were causing through their greed and callousness. When I walked through the front door of their house, I could hear them in the kitchen, their voices low but urgent, as they discussed something they obviously didn't want me to overhear. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to the murmured conversation that stopped abruptly when they heard my footsteps. "Sarah!" Mom called out, her voice artificially bright with the false cheer people use when they're trying to pretend everything is normal. "How was your drive?" I joined them in the kitchen, where they were sitting at the table with their laptops open and papers spread between them, clearly working on something related to my grandmother's estate. They closed the computers and shuffled the papers with the guilty haste of people who had been caught doing something they knew was wrong. "I found some interesting documents at Grandma's house," I said, settling into the chair across from them, with the calm that comes from knowing you hold the stronger position. "Including a copy of her will that clearly states her intention to leave me the house." The change in their expressions was immediate and telling. Dad's jaw tightened with the frustration of someone whose plans had been disrupted, while Mom's eyes went wide with what looked like genuine fear. "Sarah, we've told you that the legal situation is complicated," Dad said, his voice carrying the strained patience of someone trying to maintain control of a conversation that was slipping away from him. "Finding a document doesn't necessarily mean it's legally binding." "But it does mean that you've been lying to me," I said, my voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my system. "You've been pretending that you didn't know about her wishes, that you were just making practical decisions about an estate with no clear instructions. But she left very clear instructions, didn't she?" The silence that followed was different from their previous evasions. This was the silence of people who had run out of plausible explanations and were trying to decide how much truth they could afford to admit. "We also found correspondence between you and a real estate agent," I continued, watching their faces for reactions. "Dated 3 days before she died. You were planning to sell her house while she was still alive, weren't you?" Mom's face went completely pale, confirming what I had suspected. They had been caught in a deception so comprehensive that even they were shocked by how much I had discovered. "How did you find that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was in her desk," I said. "Along with the will you've been pretending doesn't exist, and the power of attorney documents that you've apparently been misusing to override her clearly stated wishes about her property." Dad stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor with a harsh sound that seemed to echo the breakdown of any pretense of family unity or shared grief. "You had no right to go through her private papers," he said, his voice rising with anger that seemed disproportionate to my supposed transgression. "I had every right," I shot back, standing to face him directly. "According to her will, that house and everything in it belongs to me now. I was going through my own property, looking for documents related to my inheritance that you've been trying to steal from me." The word "steal" hung in the air between us like an accusation that couldn't be taken back or softened with explanations. We all understood that I had identified the core of what they were doing: theft disguised as practical estate management, greed masquerading as responsible decision-making. "We are not stealing anything," Mom said, but her voice lacked conviction, carrying the hollow tone of someone who knows their argument is morally indefensible. "We are trying to make the best decisions for everyone involved, including you." "By ignoring a legal document that clearly states her wishes?" I asked. "By planning to sell property that she specifically left to me? By treating her death as a business opportunity rather than honoring her memory?" The accusations came out faster than I could consider their impact, months of suppressed resentment and fresh grief combining into something that felt like truth finally being spoken after too many years of polite silence and diplomatic avoidance of difficult subjects. "You want to know what this is really about?" Dad said, his facade of reasonable authority finally cracking to reveal something uglier underneath. It's about the fact that you're 20 years old with no job, no savings, and no realistic understanding of what property ownership entails. You can't afford the taxes on that house, let alone the maintenance and repairs it needs. So instead of helping me learn to manage those responsibilities, you decided to take the house away from me entirely, I said. Instead of honoring her gift and teaching me how to be a responsible property owner, you chose to ignore her will and keep the money for yourselves. It's not about the money, Mom said, but she couldn't meet my eyes as she spoke. Her gaze focused on her hands as if the truth of their motivations was too ugly to acknowledge directly. Then what is it about? I demanded. If it's not about the money, if you're really concerned about my ability to handle property ownership, then help me. Be my advisors, my guides, my support system. Help me honor her gift by learning to care for the house she wanted me to have. The suggestion hung in the air like a challenge they couldn't accept, without admitting that their real motivations were exactly what I suspected. Not concern for my well-being, but desire for the financial benefit of selling property they hadn't earned and didn't deserve. It's not that simple, Dad said, falling back on the same evasive language they'd been using since this conversation began. Yes, it is, I said, my voice carrying a finality that surprised me. It's exactly that simple. She left me the house because she wanted me to have it. You can either help me honor that gift, or you can continue trying to steal it from me. But you can't keep pretending that you're acting in my best interests when you're really acting in your own. The kitchen fell silent, except for the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from the street outside. Normal domestic sounds that seemed incongruous with the magnitude of what was happening between us. If you've ever had to stand up to family members who were trying to cheat you out of something that rightfully belonged to you, you know how isolating and terrifying that confrontation can be. Drop a comment if you face something similar. These battles are easier when you know others have walked this path. That night, I called Patricia Kelman from my childhood bedroom, speaking in whispers so my parents wouldn't overhear me discussing legal strategies for protecting my inheritance from their attempts to steal it. The conversation felt surreal, planning to take legal action against the people who had raised me, preparing to fight them in court over property that should have passed to me without contest if they had simply honored my grandmother's clearly stated wishes. Based on what you've described, you have a strong case, Patricia said, her professional calm providing a steadying influence in the chaos of family betrayal and emotional devastation. A clear will, evidence of the deceased's mental competency when she wrote it, and documentation of the executor's intention to ignore her instructions. But you need to understand that family legal battles can be expensive, emotionally draining, and permanently damaging to relationships. The relationships are already damaged, I said, thinking about the way my parents had looked at me during our kitchen confrontation, not like family members dealing with a difficult situation together, but like adversaries protecting their interests from my inconvenient claims. Then we move forward, Patricia said. I'll need you to bring me all the documentation you've found, and I'll start the process of challenging their authority to sell the house without your consent. The next morning brought new developments that confirmed my worst suspicions about my parents' intentions and methods. I woke to the sound of voices in the driveway, and when I looked out my bedroom window, I saw a moving truck parked in front of my grandmother's house, with men in work clothes carrying boxes and furniture out through the front door I had walked through thousands of times as a child, seeking comfort and unconditional love. The estate sale company had arrived a day early, and my parents had apparently given them permission to begin clearing out the house immediately, without waiting for any legal resolution of the inheritance dispute we had been discussing just 12 hours earlier. I threw on clothes and drove to Grandma Rose's house faster than I had ever driven anywhere, my hands shaking with rage and grief as I watched strangers handle her belongings with the casual indifference of people who saw vintage furniture and family photographs as inventory to be sorted and priced rather than treasures that held decades of love and memory. The front door was propped open with a doorstop, and I could see into the living room where her burgundy velvet couch, the couch where we had read together every Sunday for years, was being wrapped in moving blankets by men who had never heard her laugh or seen her eyes light up when she talked about her favorite books. "Excuse me," I said to the nearest worker, my voice tight with barely controlled emotion. "Who authorized you to remove these items?" He looked at me with the polite confusion of someone who had been hired to do a job and didn't understand why anyone would question his authority to do it. "The estate sale company," he said, consulting a clipboard. "We're clearing the house for sale." "This is my house," I said, the words feeling strange and powerful as I spoke them aloud for the first time. "According to the will, this property belongs to me, and I didn't give anyone permission to remove anything." The man's expression shifted to mild alarm as he realized he might be in the middle of a family dispute that was beyond his job description. "Ma'am, you'll need to take that up with whoever hired us. We're just following the work order we were given." I pushed past him into the house, my heart breaking as I saw the evidence of systematic destruction that was taking place in every room. Her kitchen table, where we had shared thousands of conversations over homemade cookies and afternoon tea, was gone. The mahogany coffee table with its ring stains from her teacup, the physical evidence of decades of peaceful mornings reading the newspaper and planning her day, had been loaded onto the truck. But it was her bedroom that stopped me cold, that made me lean against the doorframe as the full impact of what was happening hit me like a physical blow. Her bed, where she had slept peacefully for 30 years, where she had died quietly in her sleep just 4 days ago, was being dismantled by strangers who handled the headboard and mattress with the efficiency of people who had never considered that furniture could hold emotional significance beyond its resale value. Her vanity table, where she had applied her lipstick every morning with the careful precision of someone who believed that presenting yourself well to the world was a form of respect for both yourself and others, was already wrapped and tagged for removal. The trifold mirror that had reflected her face through decades of joys and sorrows was being carried out by men who would never know that it had once reflected the face of a young bride preparing for her wedding day, a new mother checking her appearance before church, an elderly woman applying powder with hands that shook slightly, but still carried the muscle memory of a lifetime of careful grooming. "Stop," I said, my voice carrying across the chaos of packing and removal. "Everyone stop what you're doing." The workers paused, boxes and furniture suspended in mid-motion, as they looked toward me with the uncertain expressions of people who weren't sure whether to take orders from someone who wasn't obviously in charge. "This is a mistake," I continued, pulling out my phone to call Patricia Kelman. "This property is in dispute, and no one has the right to remove anything until the legal issues are resolved." But even as I spoke, I could see my parents' car pulling into the driveway, their faces grim with the determination of people who had decided to force a confrontation rather than allow legal processes to interfere with their plans. They walked through the front door with the confident bearing of people who believed they were in control of the situation, their expressions shifting to surprise and anger as they saw me standing in the middle of the chaos they had orchestrated. "What are you doing here?" Mom asked, her voice sharp with an authority she had never used with me before. Not the voice of a mother concerned about her child's well-being, but the voice of someone protecting valuable assets from an inconvenient claimant. "I'm protecting my inheritance," I said, my voice steadier than I had expected given the adrenaline and emotion coursing through my system. "I'm stopping you from stealing property that legally belongs to me." The word stealing seemed to hit them like a slap, causing Dad to step forward with his hands clenched into fists and his face red with the kind of rage that comes from having your true motivations identified and labeled accurately. "You ungrateful little," he began, but I cut him off. "Ungrateful for what?" I demanded. "Ungrateful that you're trying to steal my inheritance? Ungrateful that you planned to sell my grandmother's house while she was still alive? Ungrateful that you've turned her death into a business transaction instead of honoring her memory?" The workers had stopped their activity entirely now, recognizing that they were witnessing a family fight that was beyond their ability to navigate safely. Several of them had already moved toward the door, obviously eager to escape a situation that had escalated beyond simple property removal into something that felt dangerous and unpredictable. "Everyone out," I said, addressing the moving crew directly. "This property is under legal dispute, and no one has the authority to remove anything until the courts resolve the inheritance issues." "You don't have the authority to give that order," Dad said, his voice carrying a threat that I had never heard before. Not the voice of a father disciplining a child, but the voice of someone prepared to use whatever force necessary to protect their financial interests. "Actually, I do," I said, holding up my phone where Patricia Kelman's number was already dialed. "My lawyer is prepared to file an immediate injunction preventing any disposal of estate property pending resolution of the inheritance dispute. The question is whether you want to do this the easy way or the hard way." The mention of lawyers and injunctions seemed to shift something in the room's atmosphere, transforming what had been a family argument into something more formal and legally serious. The workers began gathering their tools and heading toward the door, obviously wanting to distance themselves from a situation that could potentially involve law enforcement and court orders. Mom's face had gone pale as the implications of legal action began to sink in. "Sarah, there's no need to involve lawyers in a family matter. We can work this out among ourselves." "We could have worked it out among ourselves if you had been honest with me from the beginning," I said. "If you had told me about her will, if you had respected her wishes, if you had treated me like a family member whose inheritance mattered rather than an obstacle to your financial plans." The house fell quiet as the last of the workers left, their truck pulling away from the driveway and leaving us alone in the partially dismantled rooms where my grandmother had lived and loved and created a lifetime of memories that my parents were eager to erase in favor of a quick sale and easy profit. But I wasn't alone anymore, not really. Patricia Kelman was on the other end of my phone line, ready to file legal papers that would protect my inheritance from further theft. The documentation hidden in my grandmother's desk drawer proved both her intentions and my parents' deliberate efforts to ignore them. Most importantly, I had finally found my voice, the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it meant fighting the people who should have been on my side. The legal battle that followed was everything Patricia had warned me it would be: expensive, emotionally draining, and permanently damaging to any hope of maintaining normal family relationships. My parents hired their own lawyer, a sharp-dressed man who specialized in estate disputes and seemed to view the case as a technical challenge rather than a human tragedy. The court proceedings took place in a sterile conference room that smelled of industrial carpet and stale coffee, where my grandmother's life and death were reduced to evidence and testimony, where her love for me was measured in legal documents and witness statements rather than shared memories and afternoon conversations over homemade cookies. But the facts were clear and overwhelming. Her will was properly executed and witnessed. The power of attorney my parents claimed gave them authority to override her wishes was dated before the will, not after, which meant her final instructions took precedence. The correspondence with real estate agents proved they had been planning to ignore her wishes from the moment they learned about them. Most damaging of all was the testimony from her doctor, who confirmed that she had been mentally competent right up until her death, fully capable of making informed decisions about her property and estate planning. Their entire case rested on the claim that she hadn't understood the implications of leaving me the house, but medical records showed a sharp, clear-minded woman who had been planning for her death with the same careful attention she had brought to every aspect of her life. If you're someone who believes that family loyalty should triumph over legal rights, I understand that perspective. But comment below if you think there's ever a time when standing up for what's right matters more than keeping the peace. Sometimes these conversations help us think through our own values. The judge's ruling was swift and unambiguous. The house belonged to me, as clearly stated in a legally valid will executed by a competent adult who had every right to dispose of her property as she saw fit. My parents' attempts to sell it were illegal. Their use of power of attorney authority to override her will was improper, and any further interference with my inheritance would result in sanctions and potential criminal charges. But victory in court felt hollow when measured against the complete destruction of my relationship with my parents. The people who had raised me, who had been present for every birthday and graduation and milestone of my childhood, had revealed themselves to be capable of stealing from me without remorse, of treating my grandmother's death as a business opportunity rather than a family tragedy. The day I officially took possession of the house was bittersweet in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking through rooms that had been partially emptied by the estate sale company felt like visiting a crime scene where love had been murdered by greed. Some of her furniture was gone forever, sold to strangers before I could stop the process. Her photograph albums, thankfully, had been overlooked by people who saw old pictures as worthless clutter rather than priceless connections to a life well lived. I spent the first night in my inherited house, sleeping on an air mattress in the living room, surrounded by boxes of her belongings that I had managed to save from sale. The house felt different without her presence. Larger somehow, echoing with memories that had once been shared experiences but were now solitary recollections of someone whose voice I would never hear again. But as the weeks passed, as I slowly began the process of making the house my own, while honoring the spirit in which it had been given, I started to understand the deeper gift my grandmother had left me. It wasn't just property or financial security, though those things mattered enormously to someone starting adult life with limited resources. The real gift was the understanding that I was worth loving completely, worth fighting for, worth the kind of generosity that comes from seeing someone's potential and wanting to nurture it rather than limit it. She had given me a foundation, literal and metaphorical, for building a life based on different values than the ones my parents had demonstrated through their actions. I furnished the house slowly, carefully, with pieces that honored her memory, while reflecting my own emerging sense of style and purpose. Her favorite chair remained in its corner by the window, still angled to catch the afternoon light she had loved for reading. Her kitchen still smells like vanilla and cinnamon when I bake her sugar cookie recipe, following the handwritten cards I found in her recipe box. But I also added new elements that reflected my own hopes and dreams for the future. A desk in her former sewing room where I work on the writing degree I'm pursuing, with the confidence that comes from having a secure place to live. Bookshelves filled with novels and poetry collections that build on the love of reading she had nurtured in me since childhood. The rose garden she had tended for decades still blooms every spring, though I've added new varieties that she never got to see. Hybrid teas in colors she would have loved, climbing roses that will eventually cover the arbor I'm building in her memory. My parents and I haven't spoken since the court ruling, a silence that feels both tragic and necessary. They made their choice when they decided that money mattered more than family, when they chose to steal from me rather than honor the woman who had given them both so much love and support over the years. I made my choice when I decided to fight for what was right, even when it meant losing the people who should have been my allies and supporters. But I'm not alone in this house where love was the primary currency for so many years. Tyler, my grandmother's neighbor's grandson, stops by after school sometimes to help with yard work and to hear stories about the woman who used to slip him cookies over the fence when his own family was too busy to notice his hunger for attention and affection. Mrs. Patterson from next door brings me vegetables from her garden and shares memories of the friendship she and my grandmother maintained for over 20 years. The mailman, who delivered letters and packages to this address for a decade, still asks about Miss Rose and nods approvingly when I tell him I'm working to maintain the house with the same care and pride she brought to everything she touched. Sometimes, when the afternoon light hits the kitchen just right, when the smell of baking fills the air and the house feels most like the home she created through decades of love and attention, I can almost feel her presence, not as a ghost or a haunting, but as a continuing influence that shapes my choices and reminds me of the kind of person I want to become. She wanted me to have this house so I would always have a place that was mine, a foundation for building the kind of life that reflects her values rather than the values demonstrated by people who could turn family tragedy into personal profit. But the deeper gift was the understanding that love doesn't have to be conditional, that generosity doesn't have to be calculated, that family can be about more than shared DNA and legal obligations. The house on Maple Street is mine now, legally and completely, filled with furniture I've chosen and books I've collected and the slowly accumulating evidence of a life being built on principles of honesty and generosity rather than greed and deception. But more than that, it's a daily reminder that I was loved completely by someone who saw my potential and wanted to nurture it, someone who believed I deserved a foundation for building something beautiful and lasting. Every morning when I drink my coffee in her favorite spot by the kitchen window, every evening when I water the roses that still bloom in her memory, every night when I fall asleep in the bedroom that now reflects my own dreams while honoring her legacy, I'm reminded that the best revenge against people who try to steal your inheritance isn't legal victory. It's building a life so full of love and purpose that their greed becomes irrelevant. My grandmother wanted me to have a home where I could create my own traditions, raise my own family someday, and continue the cycle of unconditional love that she had maintained despite the selfishness and cruelty that seemed to characterize everyone else in our family tree. She wanted me to understand that I deserved better than the conditional affection and calculated generosity that had defined my relationship with my parents. 3 years later, I can say with certainty that her gift accomplished exactly what she intended. I have a home that's truly mine, a place where I can pursue my dreams without fear of eviction or displacement, a foundation solid enough to support whatever life I choose to build on it. But more importantly, I have the unshakable knowledge that I was loved completely by someone who knew me well enough to understand exactly what I needed to thrive. That knowledge sustained me through the legal battle, through the permanent estrangement from my parents, through the lonely nights when I wondered whether fighting for my inheritance had been worth the cost of losing my family. The answer, I now know, is yes. Absolutely, unequivocally, yes. Because what I lost weren't really family relationships built on love and mutual respect. They were obligations masquerading as affection, transactions disguised as generosity, conditional connections that depended on my willingness to accept whatever scraps of attention and resources my parents deemed appropriate to share. What I gained was infinitely more valuable: a home filled with memories of genuine love, a foundation for building authentic relationships with people who value honesty and generosity, and the unshakable confidence that comes from knowing someone believed I was worth fighting for, worth investing in, worth loving without reservation or condition. Every day I live in this house is a victory against the greed that tried to steal my grandmother's final gift. Every choice I make to honor her memory while building my own future is evidence that love, ultimately, is stronger than selfishness. And if you've read this far, if my story resonates with your own experiences of family betrayal or inheritance disputes, I hope you'll share your thoughts in the comments below. These stories need to be told, not just as cautionary tales about the destructive power of greed, but as testimonies to the enduring strength of genuine love and the importance of fighting for what's right, even when it's difficult. Subscribe to hear more stories like this one. Stories about people who chose courage over comfort, truth over convenience, love over money. Because in a world where family bonds are often corrupted by financial interests and legal obligations masquerade as emotional connections, we need reminders that authentic love still exists, still matters, and still has the power to transform lives in ways that money never can. The house on Maple Street stands as my daily reminder that I was loved completely, fought for fiercely, and given everything I needed to build a life worthy of that love. And that, ultimately, is the greatest inheritance anyone could ever receive.